She had traveled 400 miles to marry a man she had never met, and he took one look at her and walked away laughing. Then the second man did the same. Then the third. By the time the sun began to drop behind the ridgeline, Evelyn Hart was standing alone in the dirt street of Blackridge Crossing with $11, a single traveling trunk, and a crowd of strangers who couldn't stop staring. She had nowhere to go, no one coming for her, and every sensible voice in her head was telling her it was over. But one man hadn't walked away yet. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, this story is for you. Stay until the very end, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and follow along so you never miss what happens next. The stagecoach from Dunmore rattled into Blackridge Crossing just after noon, trailing a plume of pale dust that hung in the dry air long after the horses stopped. 4 passengers climbed out stiff-legged and squinting into the hard western sun. 3 of them, a traveling salesman, a young couple pressed close together, moved immediately toward the shade of the covered walkway in front of Hargrove's General Store. The 4th passenger took a moment longer. Evelyn Hart gripped the door frame with both hands and stepped down carefully, her boot finding the iron step, then the packed earth below. She was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, full through the middle, with dark hair pinned back in a practical knot that the long journey had done its best to destroy. Her dress was clean but plain. A deep brown traveling suit she had pressed herself 3 times before departure, convinced that first impressions lived in the small details. She carried a leather satchel over one arm and kept her chin up as she straightened and looked at the town. Blackridge Crossing was not what the correspondent letters had described. The town consisted of a single main street flanked by low wooden buildings, most of them sun-bleached to a dull gray. A blacksmith shop, a feed store, the general store, a small hotel with a hand-painted sign, a saloon, naturally, from which came the muffled sound of someone playing a badly tuned piano. The whole place had the feeling of somewhere that had tried to become something and then quietly given up. But Evelyn had not come for the town. She had come for one of 3 men who had written to the Dunmore Ladies' Correspondence Bureau over the past 4 months. The bureau operated simply enough. A woman submitted her information, age, background, practical skills, temperament, and the bureau matched her with frontiermen seeking wives. Letters were exchanged. If both parties agreed, the woman made the journey west. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't meant to be. It was practical, and Evelyn had always been a practical woman. She spotted her contact immediately. Or rather, she spotted the small group of people gathered near the post office steps, which was clearly the agreed meeting point. 3 men stood at varying distances from each other, none of them speaking, all of them watching the stagecoach unload with the kind of careful attention that told her they were each waiting for the same thing she was part of. Evelyn took a breath and walked toward them. The first man's name was Gerald Pruitt. He had written her 7 letters over the course of 8 weeks, each one more promising than the last. He ran a small cattle operation east of town, he'd said. He was 41, widowed, steady. He'd described himself as a man of modest means and honest intention, which Evelyn had respected. His letters had a plain, direct quality she'd appreciated. No flourish, no promises that smelled like fiction. She recognized him from the physical description he'd included. Tall, weathered, wearing a dark canvas coat despite the heat. He saw her coming. She watched his face in the moment before his expression arranged itself. That half second when a person's features do exactly what their manners would normally prevent. His eyes moved from her face down and back up, and something shifted in his jaw. Not disgust, exactly. More like the sudden deflation of a man realizing the thing he'd ordered from a catalog looked very different in person. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, stopping a few feet away. "Miss Hart." His voice was flat. He pushed back the brim of his hat with one finger and looked somewhere past her left ear. "You have a safe journey?" "Tolerable," she said. "Long?" There was a pause, the uncomfortable kind that meant something was being decided. "Listen," he said, and already the word landed badly because of the way he said it, slow and bracing, the way people say it before they deliver news they've been rehearsing. "I've been thinking since your last letter about the arrangement." Evelyn kept her expression still. "All right. I think there may have been well, a misunderstanding of sorts. He was looking at his boots now. About what I was looking for. In terms of, that is to say, the kind of woman who would suit the work at the ranch. It's hard country out there, demanding. I'm aware, she said. I grew up on a farm. Yes, well, he cleared his throat. I'm sorry you came all this way. He said it without meeting her eyes. Then he turned and walked away. And he walked quickly, like a man putting distance between himself and an embarrassing mistake. Evelyn stood still for 3 full seconds. Then she turned toward the second man. His name was Thomas Finch, and he was younger, 34, and had written only 3 letters, but they'd been warm enough that the Bureau had flagged him as a strong candidate. He ran the grain supply operation on the north end of town and had told her he was looking for a capable woman, good with numbers, steady with people. He had a round, boyish face and wore a vest that was slightly too small for him. He'd been watching the exchange with Pruitt. That was already clear from the way he greeted her, with the nervous energy of a man who has just seen something that changed his calculations. "Miss Hart," he said. He shook her hand at least. That was something. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. She counted them in her head because her mind had gone to that strange, detached place it sometimes went when things were happening that she could feel but hadn't yet processed. He asked about her family background. She answered. He asked about her health. She answered. Then he asked, with a poor attempt at casual phrasing, whether she had always been of this constitution, and she looked at him directly and said yes, she had, and after that the conversation died like a lamp with no oil. "I don't think it'll suit," he said finally. "I'm sorry." He had the decency to look mildly ashamed. Not enough to matter, but it was there. The third man didn't even pretend. His name was Dale Coombs, and he saw her coming from 15 feet away, looked at her for 2 seconds, turned to the man standing next to him, and said something under his breath that made the other man snort. By the time Evelyn reached him, he'd already turned partly away, arms crossed, body language broadcasting its message so clearly that she stopped before she'd spoken a word. "Mr. Coombs," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "Yeah, look, I got no interest in wasting your time or mine." "Then I'll ask you directly. Are you withdrawing from the arrangement?" "Already considered withdrawn." He said it like it was nothing, like she was a business transaction that hadn't worked out, and the quicker it was acknowledged, the sooner everyone could move on. Evelyn nodded once and walked away. She was aware as she crossed the street that people were watching. Blackridge Crossing was a small town, and the correspondent-wife arrangement was not exactly a secret practice. The arrival of a potential bride drew the same low-grade curiosity as any unusual event. 2 or 3 women on the walkway had been watching the encounters with poorly concealed interest. A man in front of the barber shop had witnessed the whole sequence and was now leaning over to say something to the man beside him. She heard, without trying to, a woman say to her companion, 3 of them. All 3 turned her down. The companion made a sympathetic sound that had a laugh underneath it. Evelyn kept walking. She made it to the bench outside the hotel, sat down, and set her satchel on her lap. She had $11.40. The stagecoach back to Dunmore ran on Thursdays. Today was Monday. She did not have enough money for 3 nights in the hotel. She could manage 2 maybe if she skipped meals, and then she would be sitting outside on the same bench with a trunk and no plan. The Dunmore Ladies Correspondence Bureau did not offer return assistance. She had signed the intake form herself. She had known that coming out. The afternoon heat pressed down on the town. Somewhere down the street, 2 men were arguing about a fence line in the kind of circular, rising volume way that suggested they'd been at it for some time. The badly tuned piano from the saloon had stopped. A horse tied in front of the feed store flicked its tail at something and shifted its weight. Evelyn looked at her hands. They were not soft hands. They had never been soft. She'd spent the better part of her adult life working her cousin's farm after her parents passed. Cooking, planting, hauling, mending, managing the household accounts, dealing with the men who came to buy grain and thought that a woman handling the ledger was an occasion for condescension. She had learned over those years to do things correctly without expecting anyone to notice, and to notice everything without letting on that she did. She had come west because staying in Dunmore had started to feel like a slow erasure. Not dramatic suffering, just the quiet daily experience of being someone that people looked past. She had thought, with the particular stubbornness that had always defined her, that somewhere out here there might be something different. A place where the question wasn't what you looked like, but what you could do. So far, the frontier had offered her roughly the same assessment as everywhere else. She heard footsteps stop in front of her. She didn't look up immediately. She finished the thought she'd been sitting with, counted the days, counted the dollars, made herself look at it plainly, and then she raised her eyes. The man standing there was not one she recognized. He wasn't one of the three. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean in the way that came from years of actual physical work rather than deliberate effort, with dark hair gone a little long and hands that were, she noted automatically, in worse shape than hers. He held his hat at his side. His coat was old and well kept, and he had the kind of stillness about him that some men carried, not the stillness of someone with nothing going on, but the stillness of someone who had learned to be careful about how much they showed. He looked at her directly, which already set him apart from the last 3 hours of her life. "You're the woman from Dunmore," he said. Not a question. "I am," she said. "Rowan Hale." He didn't offer his hand right away. "I have a ranch, Mercer Ridge, about 9 miles east. I'm not with the Bureau." "Then why are you talking to me?" Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, but something in the same neighborhood. "Because I watched what happened over there, and I think you handled it with more composure than most men would have managed." "That's a low bar," she said. "Maybe." He was quiet for a moment. He put his hat back on, adjusted it. "I have 2 children. Boys 12, girls 8. I lost my wife 2 winters ago. The ranch it's in trouble. Not failed, but close enough that the difference is what you do next." She studied him. "You're not with the Bureau?" "No." "So this is what, exactly?" "A practical proposal," he said, "from a man who needs help and is asking plainly instead of through letters and pretending." He met her eyes. "I'm not going to tell you it's anything else. I can't promise things I don't know yet. But I can tell you the work is real, the ranch is real, and I'm asking because I think you could handle it." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. The sun was dropping behind the western ridge now, and the light had gone that particular amber color that made everything look slightly more significant than it was. Down the street, the arguing men had apparently resolved something because the voices had stopped. The hotel behind her was quiet. The town was settling into its early evening rhythms, and somewhere out in those rhythms, she was going to have to make a decision about what happened next. "Your children," she said. "They know you're here?" "No." "And the ranch? What kind of trouble?" "Debt, mostly. Some of it inherited, some of it from last winter. We lost livestock. The house needs work. The land's good, but good land doesn't feed anyone by itself." He wasn't softening it, she noticed. He was just saying it. "Why me?" she asked. "You don't know me." "I know you didn't fall apart," he said, "when you had every reason to. And I know you've been sitting here for 20 minutes doing arithmetic instead of crying, which tells me something about how you think." He paused. "That's not nothing." She thought about the hotel. She thought about $11.40. She thought about Thursday and the stagecoach and what she would tell people back in Dunmore and what her cousin would say with that careful, not quite pitying expression she'd been perfecting for years. Then she thought about what he'd said, not about her looks or her age or her constitution, about composure, about how she thought. "I'll need to know the children's names," she said finally. Something in his posture changed, fractionally, the kind of shift you'd miss if you weren't paying close attention. "Lucas," he said, "and Clara. And the ranch is 9 miles east." 9 miles, maybe 10. Evelyn stood up from the bench. She picked up her satchel, looked at him steadily. "I'm not agreeing to anything tonight," she said, "but I'll hear more. If you want to explain the situation fully over a meal that I intend to pay for myself, I'll listen." He looked at her for a moment, and she had the distinct impression that he was recalibrating something. "All right," he said. They walked toward the hotel dining room side by side, not touching, not speaking, the way 2 people walk when they're both trying to figure out whether the other one is trustworthy and haven't reached a conclusion yet. Behind them, on the wooden bench outside the hotel, the day's particular humiliations sat gathering dust in the amber light. 3 rejections, and a crowd of people who had laughed or whispered or watched with the comfortable superiority of people whose situations had never required them to sit with $11 and decide what came next. Evelyn didn't look back at any of it. She had never been in the habit of looking back at things she couldn't change, and she wasn't about to start now. The meal at the hotel dining room lasted nearly 2 hours, which was longer than either of them had planned. Rowan ordered coffee and didn't touch it. Evelyn ordered the cheapest thing on the handwritten menu, a bowl of beef stew and a slice of bread, and ate it without apology while he talked. He laid out the situation at Mercer Ridge the way a man lays out a hand of cards he knows isn't strong, but is all he's got, plainly, without decoration, watching her face for the reaction that would tell him whether this was going anywhere. The debt was $460, owed to a man named Cecil Drant, who operated the Black Ridge Crossing lending operation out of a back office attached to the feed store. The original loan had been Rowan's father's, taken out to expand the herd 8 years ago. When the elder Hale died, the debt transferred. When Rowan's wife, Margaret, got sick the winter before last, the medical costs had added to it. When they lost 11 head of cattle in the hard freeze that followed her death, the interest started compounding faster than the ranch could absorb. "How much time do you have?" Evelyn asked. "Drant's given me until the end of spring to show improvement, or he calls it." "What does calls it mean for the ranch?" "Means he takes it." Rowan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup without drinking from it. "He's been wanting that land for 2 years. It sits between his property and the water access on the Eastern Creek. If he gets Mercer Ridge, he controls the water rights for most of the valley." Evelyn absorbed this. "And your children are at the ranch now?" "With my neighbor, May Colton. She watches them when I come into town." He paused. "They don't know I was here looking at this situation." "Are they difficult?" she asked. She meant it as a practical question, and he seemed to understand that. "Lucas is angry," he said after a moment. "Has been since his mother passed. He's not a bad kid. He's just 12, and he lost her. And he doesn't have anywhere to put it." He looked at the table. "Claire is quieter. She watches everything. She was 6 when Margaret died, so she remembers her mother, but the memories are starting to get soft around the edges, and I think that scares her." "Does she talk about it?" "No." Evelyn nodded slowly. She thought about what it would mean to walk into a house where grief had been living for 2 years, had arranged itself into the furniture and the routines, had become part of how the family functioned. She thought about what it would take not to disturb it carelessly, the way a stranger inevitably would. "I'll come out and see the place," she said. "That's all I'm agreeing to tonight." He looked at her. "That's fair." She went out to Mercer Ridge the next morning in the back of his wagon, her trunk loaded behind her, the September air carrying the first thin suggestion of the cold that was still a few months away. The ride took just over an hour on a road that got progressively rougher the farther they got from town, cutting through dry grassland and scrub, past a dry creek bed and a stand of cottonwoods that had gone half yellow. The ranch house came into view from a low rise. Evelyn looked at it without speaking. It was a 2-story timber frame structure that had probably been solid once, 20 years ago, when someone with energy and resources had built it with intention. Now the front porch sagged at one corner where the support post had rotted through. 2 windows on the upper floor were patched with boards where the glass had broken and not been replaced. The outbuildings, a barn, a small equipment shed, a chicken coop, were in varying states of repair, the barn in the best condition of the 3, which told her where Rowan's limited maintenance energy had been directed. She noticed that, filed it away. 2 children were standing on the porch when the wagon pulled up. The boy, Lucas, was exactly what she'd expected from the description. Tall for 12, with his father's coloring and the particular kind of stillness that wasn't calm, but was more like controlled tension, a body holding something back. He stood with his arms crossed and his chin up and watched her climb down from the wagon with an expression that said he had already made up his mind and wasn't interested in revising it. The girl, Clara, was half hidden behind her brother's arm. She had dark eyes, and her hair was in two uneven braids that someone had attempted and given up on partway through. She stared at Evelyn with the frank, unfiltered curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend she wasn't looking. "This is Miss Hart," Rowan said. "She's going to—" "I know what she is," Lucas said. Rowan's jaw tightened. "Lucas." "I'm just saying I know." The boy's voice was flat and controlled, the voice of someone who had learned that if you kept your tone even, the adults couldn't tell you to watch it. "We've had two others come look at the place. Neither of them stayed." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "I'm aware that's a possibility," she said. "I haven't decided anything yet either." Lucas blinked. He'd clearly been expecting something else, reassurance, maybe, or offense. Her plain agreement seemed to knock him slightly off his prepared position. He said nothing. Clara leaned a little further out from behind his arm and said, in a small voice, "Your hair is coming out." Evelyn reached up and felt the loose pin at the back of her travel knot. "It does that," she said. "Long ride." Clara considered this. Then she retreated back behind Lucas. Rowan showed her the house. It was worse inside than outside, which was saying something. The kitchen was functional but chaotic. Pots stacked without order, a larder that was half empty and poorly organized, a wood stove that needed cleaning badly enough that it was probably losing heat efficiency. The main room had furniture that had been solid once and now was just held together by habit and stubbornness. The upstairs had 3 bedrooms, the children's in better shape than the main bedroom, which had a particular quality of emptiness that had nothing to do with furniture. Margaret's things were still there. A hairbrush on the dresser, a shawl on the hook behind the door. Not a lot. Just enough to be unmistakable. Rowan saw her notice and said nothing. She spent 2 hours going through the house and the outbuildings, asking questions in a steady, methodical way that was less about politeness and more about information gathering. How many laying hens? 6, but one was old. What was in the larder and how long would it last? Maybe 3 weeks if they were careful. What was the water situation? A well, in good shape. What were the current livestock numbers? 14 head of cattle, 4 horses, the chickens. What were the immediate repair needs, ranked by urgency? The porch post, the upstairs windows before cold weather arrived, the equipment shed roof. Rowan answered all of it. He didn't seem bothered by the efficiency of the questions. If anything, he seemed relieved, in the way that people are relieved when someone finally starts taking the same problem seriously that they've been carrying alone for too long. Lucas followed at a distance, not pretending not to listen. By early afternoon, Evelyn had made her decision. She told Rowan in the kitchen, with the children absent, that she would stay on a trial basis. 1 month, no formal arrangement yet, wages if the ranch could manage a small amount or room and board if it couldn't. At the end of the month, they would both decide. "That's not how the Bureau arrangement works," Rowan said. "I'm not with the Bureau," she said. "You said so yourself." He almost smiled. Almost. All right. What followed was not a warm settling-in period. It was not a montage of cheerful adjustment and incremental bonding. It was work, relentless and daily and often thankless, and it started the morning after she arrived. She was up before dawn on the second day because the wood stove had gone cold in the night and the kitchen temperature had dropped enough to see her breath. She rebuilt the fire herself, found the coffee, and had it ready by the time Rowan came downstairs looking like a man who hadn't slept particularly well. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, saw the fire going and the coffee on, and said nothing for a moment. "I reset the damper," she said. "It was losing heat through the night. You'll need to replace the seal around the door before November or you'll burn twice the wood for half the warmth." He poured himself a cup. "I know." "Then it should probably move up the list." He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "You always like this in the morning?" "Like what?" "Efficient. I'm not sure what the alternative would accomplish," she said. She cleaned the kitchen that first week. Not dramatically, not as a statement, just systematically. The way you clean something when you know that a disorganized kitchen costs time and time is what the ranch didn't have. She reorganized the larder by what needed to be used first. She took inventory of the supplies and made a list of what was needed and what it would cost, which she gave to Rowan without comment. He read it carefully. "This is more organized than anything I've had in 2 years. It's just a list." "It's not just a list," he said, and there was something in his voice, not gratitude exactly, but the recognition of someone who had been managing alone for a long time and was starting to understand what it felt like to not be. The children were harder. Lucas made his position clear early and maintained it with the consistency of someone who had decided that the best defense was a wall with no visible gates. He was not cruel. That wasn't in him, she could see that. But he was relentlessly closed. He answered her direct questions in the fewest possible words. He did his chores without being asked, which she respected, and he left any room she entered with a plausible excuse that was never quite rude enough to be called out. She didn't push him. She had enough instinct about people to understand that pushing Lucas would produce exactly the opposite of what she wanted, and enough patience to understand that patience wasn't the same as giving up. Clara was more complicated in a different way. The 8-year-old had the quality of a child who watched everything and understood more than she let on, and who was working through a calculation that Evelyn suspected had been running since the moment the wagon pulled up. She wasn't hostile, she was just measuring. On the 4th day, Evelyn was in the kitchen attempting to do something useful with a string of dried beans and a ham bone she'd found at the back of the larder, and Clara appeared in the doorway in that silent way children have that suggests they've been there longer than you noticed. "What are you making?" Clara asked. "Soup. Eventually, the beans need more time." Clara came into the kitchen and sat down at the table without being invited. Evelyn didn't comment on that either. "My mother made soup different," Clara said. "Most people do," Evelyn said. "How did she make it?" Clara thought about it. "She put something in it, something yellow. Turmeric, maybe? Or saffron? I don't know what those are." "Turmeric's a spice. It makes things yellow and has a sort of earthy taste." Evelyn glanced at the larder. "I don't have any, but I could try to get some next time someone goes to town." Clara was quiet for a moment, legs swinging under the chair. "It probably won't taste the same anyway." "Probably not," Evelyn agreed. "It might taste different good, or it might just taste different." Clara looked at her with those dark, measuring eyes. "You don't say things are going to be fine." "I try not to say things I don't know for certain." Another silence. The fire cracked in the stove. "Lucas says you're going to leave," Clara said. "Like the others." Evelyn stirred the pot. "What do you think?" "I don't know yet." Clara hopped off the chair. "The soup smells okay." She left. Evelyn stood at the stove and let out a long breath. The first 2 weeks were full of small failures that she absorbed without making into events. She misjudged the oven temperature and burned a pan of cornbread. She scraped off what she could and served the rest without comment. And when Rowan ate it without complaint, she couldn't tell if he was being polite or genuinely didn't notice. She tried to fix the chicken coop latch herself and did it wrong the first time, and 2 hens got loose and she spent 40 minutes in the cold chasing them around the yard, which Lucas watched from the fence with his arms crossed and his face carefully neutral. She attempted to repair a section of split fence rail and discovered she didn't have the upper body leverage to drive the post stake deep enough, and had to wait until Rowan came back from the east pasture to finish it, which annoyed her. None of it was catastrophic, but none of it was smooth either, and there were moments, usually late at night when she was tired and the house was quiet, when the question surfaced whether she had made a colossal mistake by accepting any of this. She never answered the question. She just went to sleep and got up the next morning. The shift with Lucas, when it came, arrived the way most real shifts do. Sideways, when neither of them was prepared for it. It was a Thursday, 3 weeks into her stay. She'd gone out to the barn early to check on one of the mares that had been favoring her left foreleg. She was crouched down examining the hoof when she heard the barn door and looked up to find Lucas standing there with a halter in one hand and a look on his face that was different from his usual managed blankness. He'd been crying, or had been close to it, and he hadn't expected to find her there. He started to leave. "She's got a stone wedged in the outer groove," Evelyn said, without looking up from the hoof. "I'm trying to get it out without the pick slipping. If you're not doing anything else, you could hold her head." A pause. Then his footsteps crossed the barn floor. He took hold of the mare's halter and stood there, holding her steady, not saying anything. Evelyn worked the stone loose, cleaned the groove, checked the shoe. "She'll be fine," she said, standing up. Lucas nodded. His face had reassembled itself into its usual controlled expression, but not completely. There were still traces of whatever had been happening before he walked in. She didn't ask. She picked up her tools and moved toward the barn door, then stopped with her hand on the frame. "Your mother," she said, keeping her voice even. What was she good at? He didn't answer immediately. She waited. "She was good at reading," he said finally. "She used to read to Clara at night, and she was funny. People don't say that about her now. They just say she was kind and she worked hard, but she was actually funny. She'd say things that made my father laugh when he didn't think anything was funny anymore." Evelyn nodded. "She sounds like she was someone worth knowing." Lucas said nothing, but he didn't leave right away either, and when Evelyn walked back to the house, she heard him behind her for a few steps before he turned toward the east pasture. She didn't tell Rowan about it. It wasn't her story to hand over. By the end of the third week, Rowan brought up the formal arrangement. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, that a month was nearly up and he thought she probably knew already what her answer was, and if it was yes, they should go into Blackridge Crossing and make it legal before the weather turned. "It's not going to fix the debt," she said. "No. And the children aren't settled." "No," he said again. "But I think you know that nothing about this is going to be settled. It's just, are you willing to keep going?" She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the same plain kitchen where she'd reorganized his larder and burned his cornbread and had a conversation with his 8-year-old daughter about soup. The lamp between them was low. Outside, the first real cold of autumn had arrived sometime in the night. "I'm willing," she said. He nodded. He started to say something else, then stopped. "What?" she said. He looked at his hands. "I want to say, I know this isn't what you planned, coming out here. What happened in town?" He paused. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know it was a bad day for you." She looked at him for a moment. "It was," she said, "and I'd rather not make a habit of discussing it." "All right. But," she added, "I appreciate that you said something." They went to Blackridge Crossing 2 days later and made it official at the county clerk's office, with May Colton and her husband as witnesses. It was not a ceremony. It was paperwork, which suited them both. Afterward, they ate lunch at the hotel dining room, the same one where they'd sat the first night, and the conversation was easier than it had been then, without being easy. They were two people who had made a practical decision and were getting used to what that meant. On the drive back, Clara sat between them on the wagon seat, which she had engineered by simply climbing up there before anyone could arrange things differently. At some point on the dirt road back toward Mercer Ridge, she fell asleep leaning against Evelyn's arm. Evelyn did not move. She sat very still and watched the dry grassland pass and did not let herself think about what this meant or whether it would hold. She just sat there with the child's weight against her arm and the cold air coming in off the ridge and the wagon wheels finding every rut in the road. Rowan glanced over once. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The first snow came to Mercer Ridge on a Thursday in early November, which was 2 weeks earlier than Rowan said it usually did. And it arrived not as the gentle kind that settled quietly and made the land look clean, but as the hard, driving kind that came in sideways off the northern ridge and turned the yard into a gray blur by mid-afternoon. Evelyn had been watching it build since morning. The sky had taken on that particular flat yellow-white color well before breakfast, and the wind had shifted twice in the space of an hour, which she had learned from years on her cousin's farm meant something serious was organizing itself. She'd brought in extra firewood before noon, 3 trips, stacking it inside the back door until Rowan told her that was probably enough, and she'd said she'd rather have too much than discover she'd been wrong at midnight. She'd been right to stack it. By the time darkness came, the temperature had dropped hard, and the storm had settled in with the conviction of something that wasn't going anywhere until it was ready. Rowan and Lucas had made it back from the east pasture just before the visibility went bad, both of them arriving at the back door with ice in their hair and the particular grim silence of men who had been out in weather they didn't enjoy discussing. They ate supper. Evelyn had kept a pot of stew warm on the back of the stove, correctly guessing that nobody would want to wait. And the 4 of them sat in the kitchen together while the storm worked at the walls of the house. Clara didn't eat much. Evelyn noticed it without making it into an event. The girl pushed her food around and drank her water and answered when spoken to, but there was a heaviness about her that was different from her usual quiet watchfulness. By the time supper was cleared, Clara had her chin in one hand and her eyes were glassy in a way that wasn't tiredness. "Come here," Evelyn said. Clara came. Evelyn put her hand on the child's forehead and felt what she'd suspected. A heat that had no business being there, dry and aggressive, the kind that didn't announce itself with a gradual warm-up, but arrived all at once like it had been waiting for an opening. "She's running a fever," Evelyn said to Rowan. He was across the kitchen in 2 steps. He touched Clara's face with the back of his hand and his expression changed, not dramatically, but in the way that a man's face changes when something he knows to be serious has just confirmed itself. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough to take seriously?" Evelyn said. "Clara, how long have you felt this way?" "Since before supper," Clara said in a small voice. "Maybe before that." "Does your head hurt?" "Yeah." "Throat?" "A little." Evelyn looked at Rowan. He was already looking at her. "Doc Ferris is in Blackridge Crossing," he said. 9 miles. They both looked at the kitchen window, where the storm was making itself loudly evident against the glass. 9 miles in this weather, at night, with visibility gone, on a road that had no shelter and drifted fast. It wasn't a question of willingness. It was a question of whether it was survivable for the person making the attempt, and whether they'd come back in time to matter. "Get her upstairs," Evelyn said. "I need you to tell me everything you know about how to treat a fever in a child." "I'm not a doctor, Evelyn. I'm not asking you to be. I'm asking what you've done before that worked." He had done it before. When Clara was 4 and had run a fever that lasted 3 days, Margaret had kept cool cloths on her head and made her drink willow bark tea every few hours, and kept the room warm but not hot, and sat up with her through the night. He said all of this quickly and without embellishment, in the tone of a man recounting something he hadn't thought about in a long time and didn't enjoy thinking about now. "Do you have willow bark?" Evelyn asked. "In the medicine box. Top shelf in the larder." "Good." She was already moving. "Get her settled and keep her warm. Blankets but not piled. She needs to breathe. I'll get the tea started." Lucas was standing in the kitchen doorway. He'd been there since Evelyn had put her hand on Clara's forehead, and his face had gone through several things in quick succession. Alarm, then the effort to suppress alarm, then something that looked very much like a 12-year-old boy who was frightened and trying not to show it. "Is she going to be all right?" he said. "I'm going to work on that," Evelyn said. She looked at him steadily. "I need you to not be in the way and also not disappear. I may need an extra pair of hands. Can you do that?" Something in him straightened. "Yeah." "Good." She found the willow bark where Rowan said it would be. A small cloth pouch, maybe a third full, which was enough for tonight, but not much beyond that. She set water to boil and measured the bark carefully, not wanting to make it too strong for an 8-year-old. While it steeped, she tore a clean cloth into strips for compresses, filled a bowl with cool water from the pump, and went through the medicine box with methodical speed. There was not much in it. Some dried herbs she identified by smell, a roll of bandage, a small bottle of tincture she recognized as something for chest congestion, an old tin of salve. Not a doctor's kit. A family's kit, accumulated over time and not recently restocked. She brought the tea upstairs with the compress and the bowl of water. Clara was in bed with Rowan sitting on the edge of it, and when Evelyn came in, the child looked worse already. Her face was flushed and her eyes were too bright, and she was shivering despite the blanket over her. "Chills and fever together," Evelyn said quietly to Rowan behind her. "That's normal. Don't add more blankets. I know it feels wrong." She sat down next to Clara and helped her sit up enough to drink the tea. Clara made a face at it. "I know," Evelyn said. "Drink it anyway." "It tastes like dirt." "It tastes like bark," which is what it is. "Drink." Clara drank. Not all of it, but most of it. Evelyn folded a compress, wrung it out in the cool water, and laid it carefully across the child's forehead. Clara's eyes closed. The next 4 hours were quiet in the way that hard nights are quiet. Not peaceful, but concentrated. Everyone in the house reduced to what was immediately necessary. Rowan sat with Clara while Evelyn went down to refresh the water and start another pot of tea. Lucas appeared at the bottom of the stairs at one point and asked if he could do anything, and Evelyn told him to keep the wood stove going in the kitchen and to let her know the moment the water started steaming. He nodded and went to do it without argument, and she filed away the fact that crisis had produced in him a cooperation that 3 weeks of ordinary daily life had not. Around midnight, Clara got worse. It happened in the space of about 20 minutes. The fever spiked, and Evelyn could tell the moment she touched the child's face that what had been serious had crossed into something that needed more than willow bark tea and cool compresses. Clara was barely responsive, answering questions in half-words, and her breathing had taken on a faster, shallower quality that Evelyn did not like. She stood up from the bedside and looked at Rowan. His face was very still, the stillness of someone holding themselves together by concentration alone. "Talk to me," he said. "Tell me what you're thinking." "The fever's climbed too high," she said. "The tea isn't enough. I need to bring her temperature down, and I need to do it now." "How?" She thought about everything she knew, which was not medical training but was years of watching her cousin's wife manage a large household and a farm and 4 children in a place that was also far from any doctor. She thought about what she'd seen work and what she'd seen fail and what the logic was behind each. "Cold water," she said. "Not ice, we don't have it. But I need water as cold as I can get from the pump, and I need to put her in it." Rowan looked at her. "That could make her worse." "Leaving the fever unchecked will make her worse faster." She kept her voice even because one of them had to. "This is what I know to do, Rowan. I'm not guessing. This is what breaks a high fever. You can tell me not to, and I won't. But then I need to know what else you want to try." A silence. The storm pressed against the window. Clara made a small sound in her sleep that wasn't quite a word. "Do it," Rowan said. Getting enough cold water upstairs quickly was a 2-person operation, and Lucas, who had appeared in the doorway at some point during the conversation, again, without anyone noticing, said, "I'll get the bucket," before anyone had to ask him. He was back in less than 2 minutes, water sloshing over the side, his face set with a determination that made him look older than 12 by a significant margin. What followed was not clean or easy. Clara woke up when the cold water touched her and protested in the confused, fractious way of a sick child who doesn't understand what's happening and doesn't have the resources to manage it gracefully. She cried. She pulled away. She called for her father with a high, thin edge in her voice that went through everyone in the room in different ways and showed on all their faces. "I've got you," Rowan said from where he was holding her hands. "I've got you, Clara. Let Evelyn work." "It's cold," Clara said. "I know, sweetheart, I know." "Why is it cold?" "Because Evelyn is trying to help you. Let her work." Evelyn worked. She kept her hands steady and her voice steady, and she talked to Clara in a low, continuous way. Not promises, not false reassurances, just a steady stream of information about what she was doing and why, because she had noticed that Clara was a child who responded better to being told the truth than to being soothed with things that weren't true. "I'm putting the cloth here because your neck is where heat builds fastest," she said. "I know it's cold. Tell me when it stops feeling cold and I'll change it for a new one." After about 10 minutes, Clara stopped fighting. The exhaustion took over and she lay back, and her eyes closed, and Evelyn sat and watched her breathing and waited. The fever didn't break for another 2 hours. 2 o'clock, then 2:30, then 3. Evelyn changed the compresses, made another round of tea, and coaxed Clara into drinking it in small sips every time the child surfaced enough to be reached. Rowan sat on one side of the bed and didn't leave. Lucas, at some point, had come upstairs and installed himself in the chair in the corner of the room, and despite his obvious intention to stay awake, had fallen asleep sideways with his arms crossed and his chin dropped. At some time between 3 and 4 in the morning, Evelyn changed the compress and put her hand on Clara's forehead and felt something different. She sat very still for a moment, making sure she wasn't misreading it. She wasn't. The heat was still there, but it had softened. The aggressive, climbing quality was gone, replaced by something that still needed watching, but no longer had the feeling of an emergency running ahead of her. She looked across the bed at Rowan. He had been watching her face rather than Clara's, she realized, reading her expression the same way she'd been reading the fever, trying to understand the situation through the one person in the room who had any idea what they were doing. She nodded. Something left his face, not dramatically, not with any performance, just the slow physical release of a man who had been holding a specific kind of tension for hours and had finally been told he could put it down. He bent forward, his elbows on his knees, and pressed his face into his hands for a moment. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Evelyn wrung out a final compress, laid it gently on Clara's forehead, and sat back in the chair. Her hands were cold and damp, and her back ached from the angle she'd been holding for the last 2 hours, and she was tired in a way that had moved past the point of feeling dramatic and had arrived somewhere quieter and more fundamental. Outside, the storm had not stopped. The wind was still working at the house with that relentless frontier patience, testing every joint and seam and gap. The fire needed to be kept up through the rest of the night. The willow bark supply was nearly gone, and they'd need more from town as soon as the weather allowed. She started to stand, already thinking about the wood stove downstairs. "Evelyn?" Rowan's voice was low and rough in a way that had nothing to do with volume. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. He said it plainly, without excess, looking at her directly. Not as performance and not as the kind of gratitude that slides off the surface of things and doesn't go anywhere. He meant it to land, and it did. "She's not out of it yet," Evelyn said. "She still needs watching tonight." "I know." He paused. "I'll stay with her. You should sleep for a few hours." "I'll sleep when the fever stays down." He didn't argue. She hadn't expected him to. She went downstairs and put more wood in the stove and put water on to boil and stood in the kitchen in the dark with her hands wrapped around each other, feeling the warmth come back slowly into her fingers. The storm moved across the roof. The house settled into the sounds it made under pressure, the small creaks and sighs of a building that had been standing through a lot of winters and had, so far, managed to keep standing. She stayed up until the sky began to show the first gray-blue hint of dawn, which was not light yet but was the idea of light, the suggestion that darkness was a temporary condition. Then she went back upstairs. Clara was still sleeping. Her breathing was even. Her skin, when Evelyn touched it, was warm but manageable. The fever still there but reduced, no longer climbing. Lucas had woken sometime in the early morning and was now sitting upright in the chair, fully awake, watching his sister sleep. He looked at Evelyn when she came in. "She's better," he said. Not a question, but something in his voice was asking. "Better than she was at midnight," Evelyn said. "She still needs rest and the tea and watching for the next day or two. But yes." Lucas looked at his sister for a long moment. When he looked back at Evelyn, something had shifted in his face. Not completely. Not in the simple way that people shift in stories where a single moment changes everything. It was subtler than that. More like a wall that hadn't come down but had developed, somewhere in the night, a door. "You didn't sleep," he said. "No." "You stayed up the whole time." "Someone had to." He was quiet. Then, "My mother, when she was sick, the last winter." He stopped. "You don't have to say it," Evelyn said. "I know." He straightened in the chair. Nobody stayed up. Pa tried, but he had to work, and there wasn't anybody else." He looked at his hands. "I kept checking on her in the night. I was 10. Evelyn sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at him directly. "That was too much to carry for a 10-year-old, she said. "I didn't have a choice." "No," she said. "You didn't. That's the part that wasn't fair." He said nothing. But he held her eyes for a moment longer than he usually allowed himself to, and then he looked away. And the look away was different from his usual closings off. It was just the ordinary thing people do when they've said something true and need a moment on the other side of it. When dawn finally came properly, pale and cold and entirely unimpressed with the drama of the night, Rowan came downstairs to find Evelyn at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the household accounts open in front of her, which was such a specific combination of exhausted and functional that he stopped in the doorway for a moment before saying anything. "How is she?" Evelyn asked, without looking up. "Sleeping, fever's lower." He poured himself a cup and sat down across from her. He looked at the ledger. "You're doing accounts." "I couldn't sleep and the numbers have been bothering me." She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to a line. This monthly payment to Drant, you're paying interest on interest. Has he ever offered to restructure it? Drant doesn't restructure. Has anyone asked him formally in writing with a counterproposal? Rowan looked at her. No. Then we don't know that yet. She pulled the ledger back. But that's a conversation for when Clara is well and the storm clears. He watched her for a moment. This woman who had spent the night hauling cold water and holding his daughter through a fever and was now sitting at his kitchen table in the early morning gray, tired to the bone, doing his accounts because the numbers were bothering her. He thought about the bench outside the hotel in Blackridge Crossing, about the way she'd sat there with her satchel on her lap and her arithmetic and her chin up, about the fact that he had walked over to her, not out of charity. He wanted to be clear about that in his own mind, had been clear about it since the beginning, but because he had recognized something. He'd been right about that. It didn't make everything simple. It didn't make the debt disappear or the winter less hard or his children less complicated or the 100 other things that still needed solving. But it was something to know that you'd been right about one important thing when enough other things had gone badly that it was easy to start doubting your own judgment. Coffee's getting cold, Evelyn said without looking up. He drank his coffee. Outside, the storm was finally, slowly, without drama, beginning to lose its conviction. The wind dropped a degree. The sound at the windows softened. The light, thin and gray and cold, was beginning to press through. The night had taken something from all of them, the way hard nights always do, but it had left something behind as well. Not resolution, not warmth, not any of the tidy things that difficult experiences are supposed to produce. Just the particular kind of knowing that comes from having been in the same hard place at the same time as someone else, and having come through the other side still standing. Sometimes that was enough to build on. Clara recovered slowly, the way children recover from serious fevers. Not in a straight line, but in a series of better days interrupted by worse ones, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Until somewhere in the second week after the storm, she woke up one morning and ate a full breakfast and asked if she could go see the chickens. And Evelyn looked at her color and her eyes and said yes, but put your coat on first. The ranch exhaled. Not dramatically. Nobody said anything about it. But there was a quality to the days that followed that was different from what had come before. A loosening of something that had been held very tight for a very long time, and which had gotten tighter still during the long hours of that November night. Rowan moved through his work with a fraction less of the grinding efficiency of a man running from his own thoughts. Lucas, for the first time since Evelyn had arrived, came to the supper table and started a conversation without being prompted, something about a fence line in the north pasture that he'd noticed was pulling loose from the posts. And the way he said it, directly to Evelyn, as though her opinion was a reasonable thing to solicit, was so different from the careful, closed-off management of their first weeks that Rowan noticed it and said nothing, which was the right response. Clara, for her part, had made a decision sometime during those 2 weeks that she didn't announce and didn't explain. She simply began appearing next to Evelyn with the quiet persistence of a cat that is determined you belong to it. In the kitchen, in the larder, on the porch when Evelyn was checking the supply of firewood. She didn't always talk. Sometimes she just sat nearby and did whatever she was doing, drawing, braiding scraps of twine, turning the pages of a picture book she'd read too many times. And the sitting nearby was itself the statement. Evelyn didn't make a thing of it. She just made room. But the ranch's emotional weather, however it shifted, did not change the numbers. And it was the numbers that needed the most work, and they needed it before spring. Before Cecil Drant's deadline arrived with the particular indifference of a calendar date that was going to come regardless of whether anyone was ready. Evelyn had been working on the ledgers since the night of the storm, in the hours before dawn when the house was quiet. She was not an accountant. She had never had formal training in finance. But she had managed her cousin's farm accounts for 6 years, which had included negotiating with grain suppliers, tracking seasonal expenses against seasonal income, and twice finding and correcting errors in contracts that the other party had been hoping wouldn't be noticed. She knew how to read numbers in a way that most people didn't. Not just what they said, but what they implied, what they were covering for, where the pressure was building. What she found in Rowan's ledgers was not the catastrophe she'd feared, which was its own kind of information. The ranch was not failing because the land was bad or the operation was fundamentally broken. It was failing because the debt structure was designed to fail. Drant's loan carried a compound interest arrangement with a penalty clause for any month where the payment came in less than the full amount, and the penalty was not small. It added 3% to the outstanding balance, which then compounded at the original rate. 2 years of partial payments, made during the hard months after Margaret's death, had turned a manageable debt into one that was quietly accelerating beyond the ranch's ability to keep pace. She laid this out for Rowan on a Tuesday evening in December, at the kitchen table, with the ledger and a sheet of paper where she'd worked through the numbers 3 different ways to make sure she hadn't misread them. He looked at what she'd written. He looked at it for a long time. "I knew it was bad," he said finally. "It's structured to get worse on its own," she said. "Even if everything goes right this winter, even if you don't lose a single head of cattle and the spring market is good, the math doesn't clear. So what do you do with that?" She turned to the second sheet of paper where she'd worked through a different set of numbers. "You go to Drant and you make a counterproposal. You offer him a lump sum payment, not the full debt, but a significant portion, in exchange for restructuring the remainder at a flat rate with no penalty clause and an extended term." Rowan was quiet. "I don't have a lump sum." "Not yet." She set down her pencil. "May Colton's husband mentioned last month that he's been trying to find someone to take over the winter grazing rights on the south section of their land. They don't have enough cattle to use it, and they're losing the grass to overgrowth. Your herd could work that land through the winter in exchange for a fee. It's not a large fee, but it's real money. And there are 3 other ranchers between here and Cutter Creek who I've heard are having the same problem. Too much unused winter grazing and not enough cattle to justify keeping a full ranch hand on. You've been asking around." "May Colton talks freely when someone is interested in listening," Evelyn said. "I've been interested in listening." Rowan looked at her. "You've been planning this for a while." "I've been thinking about it since the storm. There wasn't much else to do at 4 in the morning." He almost smiled. The same almost smile she'd seen the first night in Blackridge Crossing. The one that appeared briefly and then was managed back into something more neutral, as though he hadn't quite given himself permission for it. "The winter grazing arrangement might raise enough for the lump sum," he said slowly, working through it. "But Drant doesn't have to take the deal." "No, he doesn't. But I want to make the offer in writing, formally, so there's a record of it. If he refuses a reasonable counterproposal, that tells us something about whether he's acting as a creditor or someone trying to acquire the land." She paused. "And if it's the second, then he may have done similar things with other people in this valley, and that's information that has other uses." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "You're thinking about involving someone else." "I'm thinking that a man who operates a lending business and designs loan terms to produce defaults has probably done it more than once. If that's the case, there may be people in Blackridge Crossing who would be interested in that information, starting with the county registrar, who is the one who would process a land transfer claim if Drant tries to call the ranch." She said it plainly, without heat. It was not a plan for revenge. It was a plan that recognized the landscape for what it actually was and found the leverage points in it. Rowan sat back in his chair. He looked at this woman across his kitchen table in the lamplight, with the winter outside pressing cold against the windows, and he thought, not for the first time, that he had been right about something fundamental the day he walked up to that bench outside the hotel, and that being right about it still occasionally surprised him. "All right," he said. The approach to Drant began the following week. Evelyn drafted the letter herself, which Rowan reviewed and adjusted for tone in 2 places where he felt she was being slightly too direct for the particular social conventions of Blackridge Crossing's business community. She accepted the changes without argument because he was right about that specific thing. She was not from this place, and there were registers she was still learning. The letter laid out the counterproposal in clear terms: a lump sum payment of $180, to be made by the 1st of March, in exchange for a restructured note at a flat 7% rate, extended over 5 years with no penalty clause. They delivered it in person. Evelyn went with Rowan, which was itself a statement. In Blackridge Crossing's business culture, a wife's presence at a financial negotiation was not standard, and she knew that, and she came anyway. Not aggressively, but she came. Cecil Drant was a compact man in his 50s with the permanent expression of someone doing arithmetic in his head. He received them in his back office with the careful neutrality of a man who had read the letter and was managing his reaction. He asked several questions about the proposed lump sum, where it was coming from, what the security was, and Evelyn answered each of them precisely and without elaboration. The winter grazing arrangements are verbal agreements, Drant said, not binding. They will be written by the end of the week, Evelyn said, and if the spring market doesn't perform, the flat rate restructured note accounts for a range of spring market performance. I've included 3 scenarios in the addendum, which I believe you have on page 2. Drant looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man who had not expected to be referred to an addendum. He did not say yes that day. He said he would consider it, which was also information. It was not the immediate no of a man whose actual goal was land acquisition at any cost. It was the hesitation of a man who was weighing options, which meant there were options to weigh. They left his office and walked back through the main street of Blackridge Crossing, and it was on that walk that Evelyn became aware, gradually, that something had changed in the way the town received her. It was not dramatic. Nobody made speeches, but there were small acknowledgments that hadn't been there in September. The woman who ran the dry goods counter, Nora Hensley, stopped her to ask about the winter grazing arrangements. She'd heard from May Colton, she said, and she wondered if her brother-in-law's operation on the west side might qualify. Evelyn gave her a straight answer and said she'd talk to Rowan. Owen Barfield, who ran the grain supply and had been Thomas Finch's business neighbor, nodded to her in the street with the nod of someone who has revised an opinion and is acknowledging it without saying so. It was Rowan who noticed the fuller picture. "They're treating you differently," he said, on the wagon back. "I've been here 3 months," she said. "People take time." "It's not just time." He was watching the road. "It's the Colton arrangement. Word got out that you organized it, and people up this valley have been trying to solve the winter grazing problem for years without thinking of it that way. It wasn't complicated. Things aren't complicated once somebody thinks of them," he said. "That's not the same as saying they're easy to think of." The response from Drant came back in writing 11 days later. He countered, a lump sum of $200 instead of $180 and an interest rate of 8% instead of 7%. Evelyn read the counter and felt something settle in her that had been slightly uncertain since the meeting. He was negotiating, which meant he was interested in the deal, which meant his primary objective was not in fact the land. She and Rowan settled on a meeting in the middle. 190, 7.5%, 5-year term, no penalty clause. They shook hands with Drant in his back office on the second Wednesday of January, and Evelyn made sure the written agreement was witnessed by 2 people who were not related to either party, which Drant noted with the thin smile of a man who recognizes a precaution and chooses not to comment on it. Walking out of that office, Rowan held the signed document at his side and didn't say anything for a moment. "How do you feel?" Evelyn asked. "Like I can breathe for the first time in about 2 years, he said. It was the most personal thing he had said to her directly in the 3.5 months she had been at Mercer Ridge, and he said it without apparent calculation, just as the plain truth. She didn't make it into more than it was. But she heard it. The winter ground on, hard and cold and demanding, the way frontier winters do, without apology and without sentiment. The restructured debt didn't make the work lighter. The cattle still needed tending in brutal cold. The house still needed the repairs she'd cataloged in September, several of which they tackled in January in the brief windows between storms, Rowan and Lucas doing the heavier structural work, while Evelyn handled what she could manage herself and kept track of what still remained. Lucas had undergone a change that was quiet enough that it might have been missed from a distance, but Evelyn was not at a distance. He had started talking to her, not about important things initially, but about the ordinary texture of ranch work, observations about the cattle and the land and the things he'd noticed and thought about. She had always answered him as an equal in terms of attention, never in a way that was condescending or overly warm, just directly and with genuine interest. And somewhere in those conversations, a working relationship had formed that was not what it would become eventually, but was real on its own terms. He had also, she noticed, started asking questions about medicine. At first she thought it was residual from Clara's illness, a practical interest in what had worked and why. But it went further than that. He had started borrowing the almanac she'd brought in her trunk, which contained a section on home remedies and field treatments, and one evening in February she found him at the kitchen table with it open, copying something into a notebook in his careful, deliberate handwriting. "What are you writing down?" she asked. He looked up. No wall, no managed blankness, just a 12-year-old who was mildly self-conscious about being caught at something he hadn't explained. "The stuff about fevers," he said, "and the part about which plants have, it says, medicinal properties. I didn't know willow bark did that. I didn't know there was a reason it worked. I thought it was just something people did." "There's usually a reason," she said, "even for the things that look like folk wisdom. How do you know which reasons are real and which are just stories?" She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "You test them. You look for patterns. You ask whether the outcome changes when the treatment changes and whether it changes consistently." She paused. "That's what doctors are trained to do. Look for what's actually working instead of what seems to be working." Lucas turned his pencil over in his hand. "Is there a school for that? For being a doctor?" "There are medical colleges, back east mostly. Some are starting up further west." That's a long way." "Yes," she said, "but so is 9 miles from Black Ridge Crossing, and you manage that regularly." He looked at her for a moment with that measuring quality his sister had, the one that ran in the family. Then he looked back down at his notebook. "I'm going to write down the rest of this section," he said. "All right," she said, and got up to start supper. It was in the second week of March that Gerald Pruitt came to Mercer Ridge. She saw him from the kitchen window, pulling up to the yard on a gray horse she didn't recognize, and she stood there for a moment and registered the fact that she felt very little. Not anger, not the residual sting she might have expected. Just a kind of detached observation, the way you look at a piece of landscape you've already mapped. She was at the door when he dismounted. He had his hat in his hands before he reached her, which told her this had been thought about and prepared. He looked different from September. Harder to say exactly how, but something about him was more careful, more self-conscious. "Mrs. Hale," he said, which was the first surprise. The name, her new name, said without apparent discomfort. "I was hoping to speak with you if you have a moment." "I have a few minutes," she said. "Come in out of the cold." She gave him coffee because that was what you did, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table and waited, because she had learned that the more you talked during someone else's apology, the easier you made it for them, and she was not inclined to make this particular thing easy. He got to it in his own time. He said that he had behaved badly in Black Ridge Crossing in September, which was true, and that he had told himself at the time that he was being practical, which was also true but wasn't the same as being right. He said he had heard about what she'd done during the November storm, and what she'd arranged with the winter grazing, and what she'd managed with Drant's note, and he wanted her to know that he'd heard it and that he understood. He used that word carefully, that he had misjudged the situation badly. Evelyn listened to all of it. When he was done, she said, "I appreciate you coming out to say it." He nodded. "I want to be straightforward with you," she continued. "I don't have a lot of feeling left about what happened in September. It was a hard day, and I came through it, and the life I have now is not something I would trade." "So you don't need to carry the apology around as a heavy thing." She paused. "But I'd ask you to remember it. Not because of me. Because the next woman who comes through Black Ridge Crossing on a stagecoach deserves a better welcome than I got. And you're one of the people in a position to affect that." Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. "That's a fair thing to say," he said finally. "I thought so." He left 20 minutes later, and Evelyn stood on the porch and watched him ride back toward the road. And she thought about September, about the bench outside the hotel, about $11.40, about the way the afternoon light had hit the dirt street of Black Ridge Crossing after 3 different men had walked away from her in the space of an hour. She thought about what she'd felt sitting on that bench, doing the arithmetic, looking at her own hands. The wind came off the northern ridge and moved through the bare branches of the cottonwood at the edge of the yard, and somewhere behind her in the house she could hear Clara's voice and then Lucas's answering it, and below that, the particular sound of Rowan's boots on the floor of the room above, steady and unhurried. She stayed on the porch a moment longer than was strictly necessary, with the cold on her face and the gray March sky overhead. Then she went back inside. There was supper to start, and a letter to draft to the 3 ranchers whose winter grazing arrangements were coming up for spring renewal, and a section of porch railing that had finally given up the struggle and needed replacing before someone leaned on it and found out the hard way. The ranch did not run itself. It never had, and it never would. But it was running, and that was not nothing. Spring came to Mercer Ridge the way it always did in that part of the country. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a late freeze. 3 days of soft rain and then a wind that came off the ridge hard enough to pull the newly repaired section of porch railing loose at one end, which Evelyn discovered on a Tuesday morning when she leaned against it with a cup of coffee and felt it shift under her weight. She stepped back, looked at it, and went to find the hammer. That was the rhythm of the place, and she had learned it the way you learn any rhythm. Not by studying it, but by living inside it long enough that it stopped feeling foreign and started feeling like the terms of things. A full year had passed since the stagecoach had rolled into Black Ridge Crossing and she had stepped down into the dust with her traveling trunk and her $11 and the particular kind of hope that doesn't announce itself because it has been disappointed enough times to know better. A year of mornings that started before light and evenings that ran long into the dark. A year of accounts and fences and livestock and weather, and the daily negotiation of a household that had been broken in ways that weren't always visible from the outside. She was still here. The ranch was still standing, and something had shifted in the balance of things. Not completely, not without remainder, but substantially enough that the people who lived at Mercer Ridge were not the same people who had occupied it 12 months ago. The first spring payment to Drant went out on the 1st of March without drama, which was itself a form of drama for Rowan, who had not made a full payment without scrambling since Margaret's death. Evelyn had worked the numbers through February with the care of someone diffusing something, managing the cash from the winter grazing arrangements, tracking what the spring market was likely to do based on the conversations she'd been having with other ranchers, building a small reserve against the kind of surprise that frontier life produced with reliable frequency. The reserve turned out to matter. In late February, the older of the 2 wagon wheels cracked through on a run into town, which was a $60 repair they hadn't planned for. A year ago, $60 unplanned would have meant a missed payment and a penalty clause and another turn of the compound interest screw. This year, it meant 3 weeks of tighter margins and one difficult conversation with Rowan about postponing the repair to the equipment shed roof until summer. "The roof can wait," she said. "The wagon can't. We need the wagon to function." "I know that," he said, with a mild edge that wasn't really about the wagon. "I'm not telling you something you don't know," she said. "I'm telling you so we're on the same page about where the money goes this month." He was quiet for a moment. This was how they argued, when they argued. Not loudly, not with the kind of heat that left damage, but in the compressed and careful way of 2 people who had made a practical arrangement and were figuring out in real time what it meant to actually share decisions. It was not always comfortable. There were things Rowan held close that he was slow to share, and things Evelyn decided faster than he was ready for, and the gap between those 2 tendencies had produced friction more than once. "All right," he said. "The wagon. The shed in June." "June," he agreed. These were not the conversations of a storybook marriage. They were the conversations of 2 people building something functional out of materials that were real and limited, and the building was sometimes ungainly and required adjustment, and neither of them had the luxury of pretending otherwise. But they were building it. That was the thing that mattered. Clara turned 9 in April, and the celebration of it was the first time Evelyn understood something that she hadn't been able to see from inside the daily work of the year. They were in the kitchen, all 4 of them, and May Colton and her husband who had come for supper, and Clara was sitting at the head of the table in a position of absolute authority over the evening's proceedings, wearing a yellow ribbon in her hair that Evelyn had ordered from the dry goods store in February and kept hidden in her trunk for 2 months. Rowan had made her a small wooden box with a carved lid, which had taken him most of January in the evenings in the barn. Lucas had copied out, in his careful handwriting, 3 stories from the Almanac's nature section about animals Clara had expressed interest in, and had bound them with a piece of twine and presented them with a self-consciousness that was entirely genuine. Clara unwrapped each thing with the seriousness of a child who understood the weight of things made by hand, and when she got to the yellow ribbon, she looked up at Evelyn with an expression that was not surprise but something deeper than surprise, The look of a child who has been seen in a specific way, who has been known, and who didn't entirely expect it. "You remembered," she said. "You mentioned it in January," Evelyn said. "I mentioned it once." "I listened the first time," Evelyn said. Clara looked at her for another moment, and then she put the ribbon in her hair with great deliberateness and turned back to the table, and the evening continued, and May Colton squeezed Evelyn's arm once under the table and said nothing, which was the right thing. Sitting at that table in the April lamplight, looking at the four people who had become the landscape of her daily life. The man across from her who was laughing at something Owen Colton had said, genuinely laughing, which still had the quality of something to notice. The girl at the head of the table with the yellow ribbon. The boy next to her who was 2 months from 13 and was quietly working his way through every medical text she could locate. Evelyn understood something that she had not been able to articulate when she was living it too closely to see it. She had not saved this family. That framing was wrong, and she had always instinctively resisted it, though she hadn't been sure until now exactly why. The family had not been a broken thing waiting for rescue. It had been a family in the specific kind of trouble that comes from loss and time and the compounding weight of difficulty without relief. What she had brought was not salvation. It was just another person, another set of hands, another mind, another presence in the house that meant no single person had to carry everything alone. That was both more modest than a rescue and, in some ways, more significant. Because rescue has an endpoint. What she'd brought didn't have an endpoint. It was just going to keep going, the daily ordinary work of being part of something, and the daily ordinary work was the whole thing. She'd had to come 400 miles and survive one of the worst days of her adult life to find that out. In May, Lucas turned 13. He had grown 2 inches since September. Evelyn had tracked it by the doorframe in the back hallway where Margaret had marked the children's heights, a column of pencil lines with dates and names that she had added to carefully. The first time with a hesitation she hadn't expected, and then with the understanding that not adding to it would have been the wrong kind of respect. He was taller than Evelyn now, which he had noted without particular fanfare, simply by standing back to back with her one morning and saying, "Huh," and walking away. The medical interest had not faded the way the interests of 12-year-olds sometimes did. If anything, it had deepened and gotten more specific. He had written, without telling anyone, a letter of inquiry to a medical college in the eastern part of the state, asking about admission requirements and what preparation was recommended for a boy his age who wanted to pursue medicine. The college had written back a real letter, 3 pages, from an actual administrator. And Lucas had brought it to Evelyn, not to Rowan, which she had registered without remarking on it. "They say I'd need to complete a secondary education first," he said, laying the letter on the kitchen table. "And they say Latin is preferred but not required now. And they say the best preparation is wide reading in natural science and practice in observation and record keeping." "That's consistent with what I'd have told you," she said. "I've been keeping records." He produced the notebook she'd seen him writing in since February. Fuller now, many more pages, the handwriting getting neater as the months went by. About the cattle, mostly. What I observe about their health and what seems to affect it, but also about the weather and how it correlates with the sickness patterns I've noticed. She took the notebook and read several pages. She read them carefully. "Lucas," she said when she looked up. "Yeah, this is good work." He accepted it with the particular discomfort of someone who cares very much about a thing and hasn't gotten used to being told they're doing it well. He took the notebook back and said he needed to go check on the yearlings. She watched him go and thought about what it meant. This boy who had been 10 years old sitting up through the night checking on his sick mother because there was nobody else. Who had made himself into a wall of controlled hostility because it was the only architecture he'd found that kept the grief from overwhelming everything. Who had, somewhere between September and May, found something to move toward instead of just something to hold himself away from. She hadn't done that. He had done that. She had just been there, asking questions and listening to the answers, which was apparently what he had needed. It was the most human thing she knew. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is be present and pay attention. Not fix them, not rescue them. Just be there, fully, and let them know that what they're doing and thinking and figuring out actually matters to someone. She had needed that herself once. She still did, some days. The spring market came in strong, which was not something Evelyn had planned for, but had allowed a small space in her projections for, because you couldn't build everything around worst-case scenarios or you ended up paralyzed. The cattle they brought to market in late April returned a better price per head than the previous 2 years combined, according to Rowan's records. It wasn't a windfall, but it was solid, and solid was what the ranch needed. Combined with the winter grazing fee income, which had expanded in the second season, 4 ranchers now, not 3, because word had gotten to a family south of town that had 40 acres of unused winter grass and no cattle to run on it. The spring settlement left them with enough to make the March and April payments to Drant, cover the wagon wheel repair, fund the equipment shed roof in June, and put just over $90 in the household reserve. $90 was not a fortune, but it was the difference between a ranch that was surviving and a ranch that was beginning, for the first time in 2 years, to have a margin. A margin meant the next emergency didn't have to be a crisis. It meant the difference between reacting and deciding. Evelyn put the ledger away the evening she ran the final spring numbers and sat in the kitchen in the quiet for a while. It was late enough that the house had settled into its nighttime sounds. Outside, the May air was cool, but not cold, and the cottonwood at the edge of the yard had its leaves back fully for the first time since she'd arrived. She hadn't known that first morning that she would stay. She had told herself she was just coming to look, just hearing more. The truth, which she was only able to see in retrospect, was that she had known on the wagon ride out, sitting in the back with her trunk, watching the dry grassland give way to the rougher country of the eastern ridge, that she was not the kind of person who looks at something broken and walks away. It wasn't nobility. It wasn't sacrifice. It was just her nature, the same nature that had managed her cousin's farm accounts and stayed up through the night with Clara and reorganized a larder and drafted letters to a creditor with the composed efficiency of someone who had decided that the situation was a problem and problems had solutions if you were willing to think clearly and work persistently. It was, she understood now, the same quality that all 3 of those men in Black Ridge Crossing had looked past on that September afternoon. They had looked at her and done an accounting of the visible and come up short. They had not looked for what she was capable of because what she looked like had told them, in their estimation, everything they needed to know. That was their limitation, not hers. She had always known that, but knowing it abstractly and living past it into something that demonstrated it, that was a different thing. In June, the equipment shed roof got fixed, and May Colton organized what she called a working bee, which was really just an excuse to gather 6 neighboring families at Mercer Ridge for a shared day of work followed by a shared meal, and Evelyn cooked for 14 people on a wood stove that she had finally gotten fully recalibrated, turning out a meal that May Colton's husband called the best thing he'd eaten since his mother's kitchen and that Rowan ate 3 plates of without comment, which was his version of the same statement. Black Ridge Crossing had not transformed into a generous and enlightened community. Towns didn't work that way. There were still people in it who had watched what happened in September with more amusement than compassion, and some of them had not revised their view, and probably never would. Human beings were not uniformly educable by experience. That was something she had accepted without bitterness, or rather, with a bitterness that she had processed and set aside because bitterness was expensive and she couldn't afford the energy cost of it. But the center of gravity had shifted, in the small ways that actually matter in small communities. The winter grazing arrangement had given 5 families in the valley a solution to a problem they'd had for years, and the families talked to each other, and what they said about Evelyn Hale, formerly Evelyn Hart of Dunmore, was not what they had said about the woman on the bench outside the hotel in September. What they said now was that she was sharp and fair, and that if you had a problem that needed thinking through, she was worth the conversation. Nora Hensley at the dry goods counter had started consulting her informally about the store's purchasing. Nothing official, just conversations over the counter about supply timing and what the ranching community was likely to need in which season. Owen Barfield had asked her twice about contract terms with a grain supplier he suspected was shorting him on weight, and she had looked at his records and confirmed his suspicion and helped him draft a letter that resolved it. She had not sought any of this. It had simply accumulated, the way reputation accumulates when it is built on actual behavior rather than appearance, slowly, without announcement, and in the end more durably than any other kind. In July, Rowan asked her if she wanted to walk the full boundary of the ranch. She looked at him. He asked it casually, in the manner of someone proposing something ordinary, but it wasn't ordinary. They had never done that together, all four sides of Mercer Ridge, which was a half-day's walk on reasonable ground. It was the kind of thing you did when you wanted to show someone the full shape of something you'd been sharing pieces of for a year. "All right," she said. They went on a Saturday, just the two of them. Clara was with May Colton for the weekend, and Lucas was doing his weekly ride of the East Pasture, which he had taken on as his own responsibility sometime in the spring without anyone formally assigning it to him. They walked north first, along the creek line, where the cottonwoods were heavy and green and the water was running clear and cold from the spring melt still feeding it from the high ridge. Then east, up into the rougher terrain where the land started to climb and the grass gave way to rock and scrub pine. Then south along the ridgeline itself, where on a clear day you could see the full breadth of the valley below. The town of Black Ridge Crossing in the middle distance, the other ranches spread out across the grassland, the line of the county road running north to south like something someone had ruled across the landscape with a straight edge. They stopped there, at the highest point of the ridge, because the view required it. Evelyn looked out across the valley and thought about September, about the stagecoach and the dirt street and the bench, about the arithmetic she'd been doing, $11, 3 days until Thursday, 2 nights in the hotel maybe if she skipped meals, about the way she'd felt sitting there, not destroyed, not hopeless, but stripped of the particular comfort of illusion. She had known, in that stripped-down moment, exactly what she had and exactly what she didn't have, and she had had to decide what to do with that knowledge. She had decided to stay. Not to marry Rowan. That had come later, in its own time, with its own complications. Just to stay, to say yes to the next thing and see what it was. "What are you thinking about?" Rowan asked. "September," she said. He was quiet for a moment. They were standing a few feet apart, both looking at the valley. The wind at the ridge was constant and cool, the way it always was up here. "I think about it too," he said. "More than I've said." She waited. I was not in a good place that summer." He said it slowly, the way he said difficult things. "After Margaret. I was keeping the ranch going, but I wasn't. I had stopped thinking past the next month, the next payment. I wasn't thinking about the children the way I should have been. I was just trying to get through." "That's not a failure," she said. "That's what grief does." "Maybe, but I want you to know—" He stopped, tried again. "What I'm trying to say is that I came over to you that afternoon because I saw someone who was in a hard situation and handling it with more dignity than the situation deserved. That's the truth of why." He paused. "But what I got was—" He made a small sound that was almost a laugh, the sort that comes when something is too complicated for a single emotion. "Was considerably more than I was asking for." Evelyn looked at him. He was watching the valley, not her. That was how he did it, said the things that mattered while looking at something else, as though the middle distance made it more manageable. "I didn't come here to be someone's solution," she said. "I know. I came here because I needed somewhere to go, and you were standing there, and the offer was real." She paused. "That's the honest version." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not making it into something it wasn't. I'm just saying what it's become." She looked back at the valley. A hawk was working the thermals above the creek line, circling in the unhurried way of something that knows exactly where it is and what it's doing. What it had become. That was the right way to say it. Not what it had always been, not what it was destined to be, but what it had become. Through a year of early mornings and cold winters and difficult conversations and one terrible night and the slow, daily, undramatic work of 2 imperfect people building a life next to each other. She reached out and took his hand. He looked down at it for a moment, then closed his fingers around hers, and they stood there on the ridge with the wind in their faces and the whole valley laid out below them, and neither of them said anything for a while because there wasn't anything else that needed to be said right then. The walk back took 2 hours, and they talked about the shed roof and the summer grazing rotation and whether Lucas's fence repair in the north pasture had addressed the underlying post problem or just the surface symptom. They talked about Clara's school situation, the one-room schoolhouse in Black Ridge Crossing, which Clara attended 3 days a week, and which had a teacher, Miss Albright, who had told Evelyn in April that Clara was one of the sharpest readers she'd had in 5 years. They talked about the second payment to Drant, which was on schedule, and the third, which was projected to be on schedule as well. Ordinary things. The texture of a life. The hawk followed them part of the way down the ridge, or one that looked like the same one, riding the thermals in long, unhurried circles, and Evelyn watched it for a while and thought about what it meant to know where you were. She had not known, for a long time, where she was. Not just geographically. She had spent years in Dunmore being a person that other people looked past, not cruelly, mostly, just with the particular casual inattention that gets reserved for people who don't fit the shape of what's considered worth noticing. She had managed a farm and kept accounts and done the daily work of keeping a household functional and been invisible inside all of it. And after enough years of that invisibility, it had started to feel like maybe that was just what she was. A background figure. A competent presence that the actual story happened around. She knew now that it wasn't true. Had known it on some level all along, but knowing and living are different things. The story had not happened around her. She was the story. Not because she was exceptional. She didn't think of herself that way, and the people who thought of themselves that way made her instinctively cautious. She was just a person who had refused, at the critical moment, to let other people's assessment of her substitute for her own, who had sat on a bench with $11 and done the arithmetic, and when a man had come and asked her a real question, had answered it honestly and asked a real question back. That was the whole of it. It was not complicated. But it was the kind of not complicated thing that turns out to be very hard. When they got back to the ranch house, Lucas was sitting on the newly secured porch railing, a thing he would not have done in September, because the railing was not yet fixed in September, but also because he would not have been sitting on the porch in September in that easy, unguarded way, with the medical notebook in his lap and a look on his face that meant he had been thinking about something for a while and had reached a conclusion about it. He looked up when they came into the yard. "I wrote another letter to the college," he said to Evelyn, not Rowan, and then looked at Rowan, correcting himself. "To both of you. I wanted to tell both of you." Rowan leaned against the fence post. "All right. I asked them about a preparatory program they mentioned in the first letter, for students who are younger who want to study ahead of formal enrollment." He held up the notebook. "I've been keeping records for 8 months now. I think I have enough to send with an application." Rowan was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just taking it in. "That's a ways off," he said finally. "You're 13. 4 years, Lucas said. "Maybe 5. I know." He wasn't defensive. He was just stating the arithmetic. "I just wanted you to know I was serious about it, not just thinking about it." Rowan looked at his son for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that was not simple. There was pride in it, and something that was not quite grief but was in the same neighborhood, the way things can be when you see your child becoming a person you hadn't quite anticipated. "I know you're serious," he said. "I've known that for a while." Lucas looked slightly surprised. Then he looked down at the notebook. "There's one more thing," he said. He glanced at Evelyn. "I asked them in the letter about what prepared students say was the most important thing, going in." He paused. "They said the ones who did best were the ones who had someone who taught them how to pay attention. Not what to think, just how to pay attention and ask the right questions." He said it, and then he didn't say anything else, which was probably because he didn't have words for what he meant and didn't need them, because Evelyn understood it exactly. She nodded. That was all. He hopped off the railing and went inside because he was 13, and he had said the significant thing, and now he needed to be somewhere else, which was entirely correct. Evelyn stood in the yard with Rowan and the late afternoon light coming down at a long angle across the grassland, and Clara came out the front door at some point. She had apparently come back from May Colton's early, and stood on the porch with her yellow ribbon still in her hair, now slightly sideways, looking at Evelyn and Rowan with the evaluating expression of a 9-year-old who has noticed that the adults in front of her are having a moment and is deciding whether to interrupt it. She decided not to. She sat down on the porch step and pulled a piece of twine from her pocket and began braiding it with the focused attention she brought to everything. And the three of them existed in the yard together in the quiet that was not empty, but full of all the things that didn't need to be said because they were already known. Here is what Evelyn Hart understood, standing in the yard of Mercer Ridge on a July evening a full year after the worst day of her adult life. That worth is not a quality that other people assign you. It is a quality you demonstrate by what you do when things are hard, not by being fearless, because she had been afraid plenty of times this year, but by doing the necessary thing while afraid, which is entirely different and considerably more useful. That belonging is not a place you arrive at. It is something you build slowly, through the accumulation of small acts of presence and care and honesty, and it takes longer than you want it to and costs more than you expect, and the result is never the clean, finished thing you imagined. It is always more complicated and more real. That a life can change entirely in the space of a single decision. Not a dramatic decision, not a decision made with full information or complete confidence, but a decision made with what you have, in the moment you have it, in the direction of something that looks more like forward than backward. She had chosen this. Not from desperation, or not only from that. She had chosen it because Rowan had asked her a real question, and she had looked at what was being offered and decided it was worth the risk. And then she had worked every day to make the risk into something that didn't require regret. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, the same ridge it went behind every evening, painting the sky in the colors that the frontier did better than anywhere else she had ever been. Deep amber, running into rose, running into a blue that went all the way down to the horizon. Clara looked up from her twine. "Supper," she said, as though this were a matter of urgent importance. 10 minutes. Evelyn said. Clara accepted this with a small sigh and went back to her braiding. Rowan's hand found Evelyn's again, briefly, and then he released it and headed toward the barn for the evening check because the cattle needed tending and the day wasn't done yet. And that was the truth of any life built on real ground. It was never fully done. There was always the next thing, and the next thing was not a burden, but the shape of what it meant to have something worth continuing. She went inside to start supper. The kitchen was warm and slightly disorganized in the way it always was by late afternoon, and she moved through it with the ease of someone who knows exactly where everything is because she put it there herself. Outside, the light was finishing its work on the ridge. Inside, the sound of a household, a real one, imperfect and ongoing, filled all the space that silence used to occupy. She had come 400 miles looking for something different. She had found it. Not because it was given to her, because she had refused at every point where it would have been easier to give up, to give up. That was the whole of it. That was enough.